We're here to talk about how you are what you eat, and that is a greater issue than simply eat this, don't eat that. It's the context in which the food is grown and prepared, the way in which it's served and by whom, and is it done with love and caring. The choices you make, and how are you communing? How are you enjoying that food in a sense of community? When I talk with the farmers that I work with on both sides of the border, they usually say to me, food isn't a commodity, it's community. And I think that's sort of the overarching theme of what we're here to talk about today. Yes, we're going to talk about some foods are better than others. I think we know that. And we'll talk about that, but we also want to talk about the larger context in which we eat those foods, how they're prepared, who's deciding whether or not they're good for us, how those decisions are being made, and how much autonomy we have in this entire process. And also a little bit about, let's be honest, how we tend to want to victim shame anybody who's making a choice that somebody, we or other, determines isn't the best choice for them. Instead of giving someone the power and the tools, the autonomy, the freedom, and making systemic changes that might let them make the choices that arguably might be better for them. So this is a big conversation. We're excited to be here and have you all in. So why don't we start first with our nutritionist? You want to tell us a little bit about how you are, what you eat?
Okay, well, I don't know if anyone noticed, but we did a brief presentation before the panel, and in one of my slides, I wrote, you are what you eat, but also what you think. So my approach is mindful and intuitive eating. It's a more holistic way of seeing nutrition, in which, of course, you are what you eat, but if for one day you ate something that's processed, you ate chips, you ate a cake, or it's not exactly that it's going to define you in a negative way, because maybe you were thinking something positive, you were happy, you were enjoying, you were socially engaging with someone else that you love while eating that harmful food. So we are what we eat, but also what we think when we eat. And I think that's something important to define first. And about what we eat in relation to longevity, that's the topic of today's panel, I wanted to focus in three things, which were antioxidants, muscle, and, well, thoughts, which I already said.
Oh, and by the way, don't worry about repeating, because obviously the folks at UCTV didn't get the benefit of the earlier presentation. So in this conversation, don't hesitate to incorporate it.
Perfect, thank you. And the antioxidant part, I think it's one of the main things we can focus in relation to longevity, because they are like the helpers of not aging, or they help us age as healthily as we can. And they are mainly in fruits and vegetables, in produce. So eating locally grown, sustainable fruits and vegetables that are antioxidant rich, which have lots of vitamins and minerals, basically, are going to help us, get to the age that we want to get in a happy and healthy, holistic way. And what else? Well, and the muscle, that's also something that I wanted to highlight, because muscle mass naturally decreases when we age. And building muscle and maintaining it, it's something really important that we have to focus on in relation to longevity. So eating the right type and quality of proteins, adequate quantities and qualities, both are important specifically in protein. In antioxidants and produce, quality over quantity. You can eat also as much as you want. Vegetables are free. But protein, we have to measure it a little bit more, make sure that we get the amount that we need, but also don't get more, because that's also, it can be harmful for our metabolism. But muscles are our metabolisms, like life insurance, our body's life insurance, because they are the most metabolic active tissues. So the more muscle we have, the more, healthy we are, and the better we age, let's say.
It's so interesting you say that, because we women of a certain age, I just happened to go to the doctor, and who said to me, because I happen to be vegetarian and that's just my choice, but that my protein was very low, that my muscle mass had gone down dramatically. And so I had to really contemplate how to incorporate more protein in my diet when I always assumed that, that was not an issue for me. It never had been an issue for me. And something to think about is that this isn't a static concept by any stretch at all. What you need when you're young versus what you may need when you're a little bit older are dramatically different. And so it's an important part to remember that it changes, and you have to sort of constantly reevaluate what your body might need. And this is the sort of personal decision aspect of it. And it is a personal one. We're not here to tell anybody what they should and shouldn't eat with some sort of noblesse oblige type, we know what is good for you, rather to hopefully provide you with information and context to make informed and better decisions for yourself. I actually want to reach out to you at that, Joy, because I know you had a personal journey that really related to eating one way, thinking it was the best way, and then finding that your body said no. And I think, a lot of us have had that kind of journey. So tell us a little bit about yours.
I had a health challenge I was trying to resolve, which set me on a nutritional hunt, really, to figure out, well, what the heck can I possibly do 3 meals a day to turn around the problem that I would like to overcome? And I was blessed to get into the concept of alkalizing, the concept of leaning away from really acidic foods and processed foods and get the body back in harmony. And that led to an even more extreme version of a diet, which was a subset of veganism, which was eating raw foods. And in its essence, I love the concept of raw food. I'm still a huge fan of raw foods. However, I took on this perspective that it was the only way, my husband and friends would call it the superior diet, and they would make fun of me. And sure enough, even though I turned my career in that direction, I was able to do content and restaurants with big name people and big name brands, from Deepak to Some Warrior Foods, just, getting a nod from Huffington Post, all these things that felt really good for my ego. Right at about the peak of that, I started to get really sick. And that, of course, put me in a really deep pickle, because wait, I'm advocating for this, and now something's starting to go sideways. What in the heck am I going to do? And so instead of pushing through and just maintaining that had to be the right way, I landed a really severe case of SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And for a New York minute, you guys, I decided, well, the right way around it is more of what I've been doing, right? So the right way around it, the only way is through. I just got to keep on. I'm going to eat more clean. I'm going to eat more vegetables, I'm going to eat more raw food. And it kept getting worse and worse and worse, okay? And so finally, I had to wake up and I had to look at other modalities of eating. I had to pull in, Chinese medicine concepts and all different forms of concepts. The most humbling one for someone who loved raw vegan food as much as I did was, I remember having to reach out to Jesus Gonzalez and being like, I don't know how to prepare meat well. I don't know how to make bone broth. I don't know how to do all of these things that I need to start incorporating in my world. So it was, it knocked me off my pedestal. It was very humbling. It forced me to get out of my lane and look at the entire picture of eating, right? I was already very concerned with how's it grown? Where does it come from? Eating together. That was a really big deal. But to think of, I actually have to start consuming animal protein in my, I needed to make bone broth. I needed to do all these things that felt sort of out of my scope. It was a huge wake-up call, and it was what brought my body back into balance and helped it go away. So it was like, yes, raw food. I was overcoming my fertility process. I turned my body around very quickly. But then staying in that lane too long led to a completely other problem. So was it a good modality to get out of the, processed foods? Like, my parents didn't know any better. They were like, yeah, this is easy and this is fast and this is great. And so then when I came time and I wanted to have Maverick, my son, it was a problem for me. And raw food was a good short-term medicine to get the result that I wanted. I still think juice cleanses and raw food diets, like, they have a place, right? But their place in an extreme form, I don't believe that that's something that we can embrace all the time. I think that it's something that we have to say, how do we take the elements of raw food? And this is my favorite part. So if I want to reduce the amount of protein, because I don't love the way that agriculture I don't love the way that big farming is, or specifically the meat industry is handling that. How can I take these cool procedures that I've learned in the raw vegan space and make something from brown rice and beet and mushrooms and all of these herbs and make a beet and rice, based burger that tastes delicious? It's so good. So I love to sort of steal from this modality and solve the problems that I want as I live my life in the middle road. So, you don't want to spend your time, money, and energy on dairy products if you don't love the way that's handled. Great. Well, pull from the raw food cuisine, making cashew cheeses and nuts from the fats of other products instead of it having to come from dairy. So having gone through the journey that I've been on now, I know that the right thing to do is to listen and study and be open to people who are putting a path in front of you, but don't get sucked into it, right? You have to go into it, feel what is in this for me that I can incorporate. So, I had a great experience from raw food. I had a bad experience from raw food, but I will now pull from all of those things to make a midline pathway that is in alignment with my values. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I had my own sort of journey with raw veganism, and I did a hardcore 3-monther, probably inspired by you. And it was fantastic. No, I mean, it is very cleansing, but I remember thinking after doing it that this isn't, for me, something that would be a permanent lifestyle choice. We need some cooked foods. We need some other foods. And so I think that probably my takeaway from that was, 80% vegan and 20% other is kind of a nice balance. Again, that's probably not inconsistent with your chart as well. Whole plants, a lot of raw. That's also consistent with Michael Pollan's book, eat food, mostly plants, not so much. It's a very simple diet advice. And I think that probably is true. But actually, as you were talking about the messaging and the superiority and, sort of this idea that this is the best and it's the hardest, the most difficult, it must mean that I'm better and it must be the best thing for me. That seemed to me a perfect lead in into you, Charlotte, to talk about messaging and who's deciding what's best and is it really best?
Yeah. So my take on the question of, you are what you eat and how we navigate around this is really comes as like a cultural historian. So I'm interested in the question of like, where did our ideas about good food and bad food come from? And where do our ideas about what it means to eat right come from? They have a history, right? And what I learned in my research is that from ancient times, people followed dietary rules or guidelines that were primarily religious and ethical. They oriented people towards how to be a good person. And with the advent of modern nutrition at the end of the 19th century, we tend to think that what happened was, nutrition was born and nutrition became purely scientific and separate from those guidelines or ideals that informed dietary advice previously. But what my research found is that nutritional quantification, all the numbers and the columns and the tables that tell you what a good diet is using the numeric language of nutrition, sort of is an overlay on top of an existing ethical foundation that's still there. It's just that we don't often acknowledge it. We have a hard time. We don't have a great language for it, although it often gets a head nod or an aha when I start to talk about this because, like your experience of, feeling quite superior because your diet was awesome. And it wasn't just like, this is great biomedically. It's like, I am this person who pursues eating right. And that makes me a certain kind of individual, right? In relationship to others, maybe more responsible. Maybe I have more willpower. I can recognize myself as morally superior, actually. And that is baked into it, right? That's not a fault of any one of us or very unique, even though it may feel idiosyncratic in how we experience it. It is actually part and parcel and inseparable from the very act of giving dietary advice. So what I found in my research is that dietary advice always, contains the rules, And during World War II, it was 7 food groups, right? And now we had 4, and then we had pyramids, and then we had plates, and right? So it tells you what to do. But there's also always a component in there that's a little harder to recognize, but that I really like to advocate for us to recognize, which is that there's a message in there, what I call a pedagogy of good citizenship, meaning like lessons about how to construct and perform oneself as a good person, a moral citizen, as responsible, as having the qualities that are associated with being a good person at any given time. And this is inevitably going to create hierarchies, right? And those hierarchies in the history of eating right in America are highly classed and raced. And so, right, head nods all around. So we know this, and yet we often don't have the language for it. We don't identify it. We talk a lot about the importance of understanding where our food comes from, but not enough about understanding where our dietary advice comes from and its history. And that's, yeah.
Well, actually, that's a perfect pivot, because we've been talking about individual choice and whether or not it makes us feel superior. There's a flip side to that, which is the judgment of other choices. And then let's not talk just about the fact that it might be a personal choice, but there are systemic factors making those choices for you. So that seems like a perfect pivot to you, Emily. But by the way, I'm only nudging you now, but eventually I'm just hoping they'll have nice crosstalk here.
Well, and so I was recently thinking about this dilemma with ultra-processed foods. There's been Charlotte's work charts nutrition scientists who think that the cause for ultra-processed food, why people don't want to eat ultra-processed foods, is ignorance. But there is an emergent movement of scientists that are trying to label ultra-processed foods as dangerous. And there's a little piece of me that wants, you can get on board with that and, kind of goes into that, I would rather eat less commercialized food. And, I could kind of feel myself getting kind of pulled in, like, yeah, that seems like it makes a lot of sense. Let's label our food, our ultra-processed foods, and so we can see. I have 2 kids, I work a lot, I feed my kids a lot of rapid food, a lot of things pulled out of the freezer and put in the oven, and they're cooked, by somebody else in the freezer. And
There's no judgment on this panel.
Okay, so
I got off my superior
or in this
diet,
room.
so I'm not going to judge you.
and so I was thinking how easy it is to get pulled into these. Well, there's an individual solution. I could just eat less ultra-processed food. When really I want, I would say to myself, like, the no judgment. Like, we live in these big global systems that shape the way that we eat, and if we can't be addressing those larger systemic issues behind the labor force, and I'm cited before. Hannah Landecker is a food historian, cultural historian at UCLA, and she has an article that is "You Are What You Eat" eats, to kind of shift our attention further downstream and in lines of production. But she also draws attention to sleep and circadian rhythms and what happens with shift work. So, we put our focus on, nutrients and nutrition, but if we started to talk about, is there humane systems of labor so that the people that are, kind of driving the food, food production can have decent rest. I think that piece of rest often isn't included enough in these conversations. And for rest to be possible, we really do have to be looking at big systems of labor and production around labor. So, yeah.
Well, I was thinking, when you say you are what you eats, the first thing that comes to mind is animals, right? You're thinking about, what do they eat? Are they, for example, with animals, is it pasture raised? Are they eating grasses? Are they being fed GMO corn? But also, as you described, it really includes those who labor and toil, because they're the ones, and it's true in a lot of systems. I don't think the U.S. agricultural system, certainly, that in many of the communities in which the vast majority of people live and grow and take care of the food that we eat, they don't even have the same fresh produce available to them. They're sort of in food deserts or swamps, whichever way you want to put it, which have fast or convenient food, not much fresh food. And then they also, if it's in this sort of non-organic regenerative context, they're also being subjected to an inordinate amount of chemicals. And we see that in all of the research and how that's affecting the farm workers themselves and their families. So there's a whole, bigger dialogue to have about you are what you eats, which includes animals, humans, and everyone in the system itself. And also the fact that those systemic sort of issues limit your choices, because I have a garden. I grow my own food and it's organic, so I'm pretty fortunate. This came from my garden. I brought it in the car yesterday. So probably not permitted to bring that across the border. Take that out of the video. But anywho.
We'll eat it all. We won't take it back.
Doesn't leave this room. It's here for research. So, obviously that means I'm fortunate and I am able to have a very clean, whole food diet, and I try to limit, my processed food. But that isn't available to everybody, whether it's time, work, money, community, opportunity, and those are the systemic changes that we have to focus on. And so I don't know if you want to add any more on that.
I will just say, so anytime I start thinking about, making dietary change that's about what we're, the particulars of what we're eating. So eat more, eat less, exercise more, eat this, not that. I do try to shift my own thinking, to the 3 points that I try to go back to are, where is land sovereignty in this issue? Do people have access to land on which to grow food? Where I work in Guatemala, people tend to grow food really well when they have their own land. We'll talk about regenerative agriculture in a minute, but there's a lot of skill and knowledge. So, do people have land? Next question. A lot of America's food is grown by migrant labor. Do people that are growing food have access to safely cross borders to grow this food? I cited, 90,000 people have died since 2014, according to the UN's global data portal on migrant labor in the Americas. It's when we're going to talk about longevity, I do think we need to be thinking about, the missing migrants in our communities that are largely in Guatemala moving to be part of cheap labor in U.S. food production.
I want to follow that, and then I'm going to hand it over to our agronomist on the end. But it's an interesting phenomenon. In the United States, we tend to perceive the states in the middle of the country, Iowa and so forth, as being the predominant producers of food. But in fact, they're not. They produce commodity crops, which go into processed food or ethanol or feed or lots of other things. In fact, California is the number one agricultural producing state in the country. It produces 50 to 90% of everything we eat, which according to the Farm Bill, this is fascinating. If you want to know what's the problem in the U.S. food system, you only need to look at the Farm Bill, which many groups, including Kiss the Ground and others, are working to change. But in fact, things like everything in this basket is considered a specialty crop in the Farm Bill. That's along with orchids, roses, and cactus. Now, and it is by far the smallest piece of the Farm Bill. The largest goes to the commodity crops, which go into other things than what we simply eat. So there is that dynamic. And so I want to talk for a minute about this dynamic of, okay, California is the number one producing state of agricultural food that we eat, and the vast majority of the labor is being done by migrant labor. And yes, there are serious issues with the ability of folks to pass. And it's a fascinating story. If you go to some of the communities, specifically in Mexico, that Michoacan is an example, where people historically have had a tradition and a culture of traveling north to work seasonally and coming back home. And that was, okay. They went up, they came back, they were able to support their families, they were able to be with their families, they were able to return. Of course, with the closing of the border, people who come up can't leave, they don't have the mobility. It's had a detrimental effect. It's changed policy in a way in the United States that we continue to see today. And it's also adversely affected the communities in Michoacan, where the people who've left, their families don't have that support of that human. Some of the younger kids are getting into trouble. So it's a huge issue. And we have to be mindful of that. This isn't just an issue of choose this, not that, but who's growing. If you're not growing it yourself, and that's a very small percentage of us, who's growing it? How do they live? And what are their opportunities? But now let's go back to the soil, and let's talk about other ways to grow and how the soil microbiome, which we're studying now, is very much connected to the gut microbiome, which we are beginning to understand sort of dominates our health across the board.
I'm thinking, continuing on this line, no? Because I was thinking while you were speaking about Cuba. No? So, for example, what happened when the Soviet Union fell, no? And Cuba suddenly went from big ag, from basically sugar plantations, no? And exporting and everything, to a severe energetic crisis, no? And it's there's a very old documentary because very old. I remember watching it in college. It was when maybe 16, 17 years ago. That's called The Power of Community, and it's about what happened. No, it's this extreme, very extreme case study of what would happen if there was an actual collapse, no, of the system. And it also touches on what you said about land sovereignty, because it's not only about having access to land at a certain point in time, but also about continuing the knowledge of how to farm and how to handle the soil and having the seeds, no? Because when I studied agroforestry in Chapingo. It's a university in the center of Mexico, and there was this Indian researcher called I forgot his name, but his last name is Krishnamurti, and he presented a study where they were looking at food insecurity and malnutrition in Mexico, no? And two of the states that had the lowest malnutrition rates were Yucatan and Monterrey, no? And for very different reasons. But Monterrey, because the capacidad de compra, the ability to purchase is generally higher, so you can purchase the food. But in the Maya communities, or the Maya place they were studying, it was because they maintained these home gardens that had an incredible diversity. You know, they had, several different species of chiles and fruits, and all in the same really small space, no? But an incredible diversity and incredible productivity. But this is a very complex system. O sea, it's not just about having land; it's about knowing each plant, what it's for, what cares it needs, what manure is better for it, or what type of fertilizer is better for it. Because in Carroya, I handle the organic vegetable garden, and it's intense. O sea, having getting to the point where you can have the best artichokes with the exact size and the exact the zucchinis, and it's complex, no? So I guess continuity. I was just thinking about that, no? Continuity in knowledge is because in cities. This is very, very hard, and people that maybe came from these agricultural communities, no, and a lot of migration to the cities and everything, it can be lost in a generation, the seeds and the knowledge. No? With one generation that doesn't practice it, it's gone. No? So, I don't know.
I'm curious.
No, this is how it works.
Okay, so I have this question in regards to the dirt and the soil and growing things. And I know that the answer has been like, crop rotations, for example. Let's rotate. Well, this depletes the soil of that, so let's rotate. We're going to put in a different crop here, and then it'll take different things out of the soil, and it'll be fine. But my question for you, because you've dove so deeply into this, is even though it's not convenient, because we can't produce the food on the farms in mass. Mm-hmm. So one giant crop of this, one giant crop of that, which I imagine it's easier to harvest it together. It's easier to sell it together. It's easier to, distribution, everything. It's just easier if we separate it. Mm-hmm. But what's your take on like one root gives off something that another plant needs, and that there is benefit in having a mishmash of an unorganized, unsegmented creation of food? What's your take on the importance of that?
Definitely each plant harbors very particular and different microbiome, for example, no? Yeah. And different plants have different pests and different diseases that attack them. So obviously a diversity in the garden itself, you can avoid intense pest problems. It's like thinking about a natural ecosystem where diversity is such that there is no space for one species to become dominant over the whole system. Because if you have just a maize plantation, then it's a buffet for the pests of maize, no?
Yeah.
But if you have this diversity, then you have, flowering plants that will harbor insect natural enemies, to the pests of corn. And this has to be designed, of course, no? Because, for example, for each system, you know, when you're starting to design an agricultural system from zero, from scratch, imagine there's nothing and your principal or your main plant is vines for grape production, then you need to think about what are the insect pests of the vine, and then you need to think about plants that will accompany that will harbor not more of the same pest. You need to choose plants that will harbor natural enemies, that will give them a safe haven in times where your pest is not active, where they can eat nectar or overwinter or reproduce or no. So this is why, I mean, organic agriculture and really agroecology, not conventional organic agriculture, which can be a monoculture, is very intensive in knowledge, because at the end you're applying ecological principles to the design of the system and using that and using that to your favor. And see, it's not diversity in general, no, it's diversity that is complementary to each other, and that's the thing.
Yeah. It's symbiotic.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it does work better that way, which seems like a perfect lead-in.
Exactly.
You know, like most things, you know, community is better than like being alone. If you want to go far, go together, right? And if you want to go fast, go alone. No, but we want to go far. Maria, this sounds like a perfect lead-in, because this is exactly how you run your vineyard at Los de Tres Cantos.
Yes, and in fact, we do regenerative agriculture, and also we have biological corridors that are placed depending on what you want. If you want more nitrogen for the soil, or you want other things, no? So I think that's very good. And in fact, the other day, we are incursioning on the natural wines, and the natural wine cannot be named as natural if the grape is not also ecological. So it's like a round circle that goes all together, no? And we, for example, when we start Los de Tres Cantos, the vineyard doesn't exist. We put it from the scratch. So we start being ecological because we didn't put any nutrition, synthetic, any pesticide, anything, no? And at the end, I think that, as you say, it takes more time to have a good grape, and it's right that the wine is done in the vineyard. If you have a good grape, you are going to have a good wine. And if you don't, the enologists are not magicians. So it's good to have a good grape, because that is going to be the session, like the 80% of the wine that you produce is the one in the vineyard. So I totally agree with that.
And this is, I think, the work in large part of organizations like Provino, who is the host of today's event and conference, which is to help educate other winemakers, vineyards, on how to do more sustainable practices. The whole point of this Conferencias en Flor is to have people like you share your knowledge, and you're already working on other vineyards and so on, just to sort of improve that dialogue and expand that mission.
Yeah, and in fact, there are not too many vineyards in the valley that used to do this type of regenerative agriculture. I think that we might be 4 or 5. So of 100 or more that there are in the valley.
And many more to come in the next 5 years.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think that's what I was talking before, no? We have to share the expertise that we have in everything, not just in wine in moderation, for example, but
your other slightly unpopular idea. No, I'm kidding.
But we have to share what we know, so other people can implement things that are the knowledges that they've helped not only the agriculture but ourselves. So I think that we are in that way, and Provino and other organizations should implement this, no? By training, education, and all that to other vineyards.
And I think they want to sign you up.
Okay.
to share your experiences. No, I want to follow up on the wine in moderation, because we are talking about you are what you eat and drink. And this has been a passion project started by the EU. You've gotten involved. I'd like to hear more about that, what that means, and why it should be more popular than it might at first sound.
Yes, well, you know that wine always is introduced in a bag with distillated. So there is a lot of fake news, a lot of miscommunication in the social media, in papers. The clinical papers that in fact are published are done as epidemiologic clinical papers, done with observation. So they are not very conclusive. We cannot say that having a glass of wine or 2 glasses or none is good for the health, because we cannot measure that right now. So I think that what we have to think about is that wine is a fermented, so it has a lot of antioxidants, very powerful. So if that's good for the health in terms of nutrition, why not for the wine, no? For example, there has been last year in Spain a very interesting congress that was led by Wine in Moderation, but where many organizations of wine, very important around the world, included, where there were gathered 30 professionals, not only cardiovascular, but nutritionists, researchers, and they expose their studies, and at the end they make a roundtable and they make 2 conclusions, which I think that are very, very good for the people to know. One is that if you have more than 40 years, there is like a J curve that when you take 1 or 2 glasses of wine, is not going to hurt you. But if you take more, perhaps it's not going to be good for the health, no? So that's important to know, because at the end, you are the one that take your decisions. And if you are well informed, you will take the decisions that are good for your body. So, and the other one, very interesting, by the way, is that the Mediterranean diet, in which the wine is included, is the best diet for a healthy life and for a increased life expectancy. So if you have a Mediterranean diet associated with physical activity, with resting, with gathering with people and with friends, with family, that's the index of Mediterranean style. So if you take all this into account, you're going to live longer. And that's something that is stated, and that's why I think that we should moderate our drinking, and not also moderate, but also enjoy drinking, and make of the drink more an experience, no? So that's...
I want to reach out to you, about the blue zones. Perfect.
Oh, exactly. That's what I wanted to say. Like, now that you're talking about the Mediterranean diet and how it includes wine, there are different communities around the world that are studied because of their longevity and their lifestyles that are really wholesome and nourishing for living longer and happy, healthier lives. And they all kind of follow a Mediterranean diet in a way. And these are the blue zones. That's why
Explain the Mediterranean diet a little bit too. Yeah. No.
Like, why? How are they
Or
measuring?
what is the Mediterranean diet also?
Sure, because it's like there's more centenarians, meaning people who live to 100 or more in those zones.
Yes.
Which I think, like, all of those zones, when I look at that, not just the similarities in their diet, but I feel like there's such a component of belonging in those things, like belonging, like how the soil can't be, the farms can't go unless the generation is educating the one before, the seeds are educated, like passed on before. I feel like there's not just the nutritional component in the blue zones, but there's also that social, like the whole diet piece, the growing food is community. There's a human belonging element that is so woven through those areas.
Well, I think it all correlates and it's synergetic with what she shared and everything. Like in the blue zones, they follow a type of diet and they eat in a way that they also have farming, like sustainability in their produce. They also enjoy the wine and share it in community. They also make decisions that maybe are not like as influenced, or they don't stress out about the dietary guidelines. They just like live, they just enjoy, they just eat whatever their body needs. Also, like they eat a lot of like 95% plant-based, which we also in relation to like your raw veganism journey and everything. We know that plant-based is the key, but it doesn't mean that you cannot add 5% of also animal source protein, that it's lean, that it's good for you. Some fish that has omegas that are really good for brain health, which is important to get to an older age in a healthy way. They also they combine plant-based protein. So if you're a vegan, vegetarian, you can of course have an adequate amount of protein by combining legumes and whole grains. So beans, the people in the blue zones, which are, I'm going to mention some that I remember, but Sardinia in Italy, Okinawa in Japan, there's one in California, Loma Linda, and there's different specific communities around the world that also what I've noticed is that they are somewhat small, like cities, small, that they get to have that sense of belonging better because they are in touch with their ground, they are in touch with other people, they know where their food comes from. So they summarize everything that we've discussed in a community, and that's why they live to more than 100 years. I guess that's one of like the key things. Yes.
Can I jump in here for a second? I just wanted to name something that I'm hearing across all of our conversations that I think it's on some level obvious and on some level really important to just point out, which is that a lot of the ways that we're talking about good food in this conversation is really a very broad perspective on that, what that means. We might call it a social perspective because we're incorporating things like belonging, things like the welfare of workers in the food chain, things that are not inherent into the food itself. And for a very long time in the US, at least, the predominant lens for thinking about and measuring good food has been the science of nutrition. The science of nutrition was not designed to, nor is it built to or have the tools to include any of that. Mm-hmm. It's about understanding the chemical composition of food and its effect in very narrow ways on the human body, right? Particular nutrients, particular biomarkers. It's a very specific kind of a lens. And so what we're talking about here is really a challenge to an established kind of authority and expertise that has long dominated conversations about good food. And I will just add that the conventional food industry is still very attached to that lens because it is a lens through which mass-produced processed foods of the kind that we're all used to seeing can appear to be good because it can have a good looking nutritional panel on the side of it, right? And my new book that's coming out in August is really about how the food industry has so invested its own sense of its own authority in nutrition science and in science in general. And that requires a defining all the questions we're talking about outside of the scope of what matters, outside of the kind of questions that matter about food, the food system, the future of food, and construing of those in more narrow nutritional terms, for example. So I think what we're doing is really important in terms of challenging established expertise in it. It bears me.
But I also want to say that even within the limited lens of nutritional analysis, there isn't entire agreement, right? And for example, in the United States, there are two primary nutritional organizations made up of dietitians and nutritionists. There's the ANS, I believe is the acronym, which is largely corporate funded and has a bit of more of a sort of corporate presence. Then there is the ANA, American Nutrition Association, which doesn't permit any corporate funding and has a little bit more what I'd call left-leaning sort of ideology. They're very anti-processed foods. This side is the one that might say, well, maybe not. So the point is, even within that construct, there is disagreement, and it turns out to be either governed by politics or money or both, since they are intertwined. So go ahead. Either or. Jump in.
Well, I was just thinking, I guess, an important thing to point out is that there's not just one correct way to eat, no? And this, I don't know, the whole nutrition, como el quehacer del nutriólogo, the nutritionist, work, comes in handy when this whole cultural inheritance is not there anymore, no? Because I thought of another study by Mexican anthropologists in Pachuca, where they studied Otomi communities, where one group, they were both in the same socioeconomic conditions, I guess, no? And one group tried to supplement their protein and their dietary needs with the approved nutritional, conventional way, which turned out to be excessively expensive, no? And it's a lot of dairy, a lot of meat, a lot of to supplement, and they found lower malnutrition rates in children that kept that had this knowledge of native plants and what was still kind of foraging, and we're more connected to the, and it does have to do with the specific context of what is, no? Because at that point I was in the Otomi region, and I was working on an NGO, and they were trying to build vegetable gardens for them. But that was not the right approach, because there was no water. We had to take the water, to subsidize the water for the amount of time that the NGO had the funding, and then this project was necessarily going to fail. Yeah. And this is when I found the study. We should not try to apply the same solutions for everything. We should have been trying to understand the diet that could work for these people, and trying to work with the native plants for them.
Mm-hmm. I think this is a problem often, whether it's governmental or NGO attempts to address, real situations, problems, is that they sometimes come at them with sort of a one-size-fits-all model instead of starting from the community, learning, and then because they do have expertise, they do have knowledge that can be extremely beneficial, but it depends on where the starting point is. I know what you need, or tell me what you need, and let me see if we have something that might help you, create a solution for your specific environment. And I think it's a way, you have a paradigm shift in how those with that, scientific and other knowledge come about their attempts to address solutions. Go ahead.
So this is jumping off of what Charlotte was talking about with the history of nutrition, but I love the story of Pellagra and Joseph Goldberger. And if you don't know it, you should go read about it. But really briefly, he became essentially the first director of public health in the United States. And in 2014, he was tasked with the problem of figuring out what was happening with all of these prisoners and military workers who were dying of what they thought at the time was a contagion, because in these clusters of people were all getting sick with pellagra. And they didn't at the time have the concept, or it hadn't integrated the concept of the nutrition deficiency. And so people thought it was a contagion illness. And what he did, he stood up on stage in 1916 and injected himself with pellagra to show, this is not a contagion. I'm not going to get this. And within a few years, they had discovered nutrients and Mark niacin, and they had been able to map and teach us essentially that we know today there is these nutrition deficiencies. So the reason people were getting sick in prisons and militaries is they had a really low nutrient corn that they were all eating that didn't have the essential amino acids for binding. So meanwhile, Guatemalan women have used nixtamalization to unbind that niacin by cooking with lye and making corn. And and they didn't need all the language of nutrition and nutrients to do that. But the piece that's really striking to me today, I love your TED talk of a diet from diets, because we know dieting actually doesn't work well. In this knowledge of nutrition deficiency that we have, I think it's actually, we've been taught, now we know, so now we understand. But I actually think there's a lot left that we don't know and don't understand. And that maybe if we continue to look at what people who have been involved in producing food in communities, I will throw out in case the word companion with bread. We make our communities by the way that we eat together. And so the thought that there is still a lot, we have the narrative in nutrition science that, well, now we understand what a nutrition deficiency is. I think we actually don't know. And that some of the sense that we have, discovered this knowledge, I think there's still a lot left to be learned from the people that have been involved for generations in this work. So,
yeah, please.
Sorry. No, and that also those people, they do it intuitively. They don't, like, no one goes and teaches them, like, you have to do your crops this way, you have to eat this and that, like the Otomis, or like in Guatemala, or all of the communities that you've had the chance to interact with and learn the fact that they have, or even the blue zones. Like, of course, the blue zone in Japan doesn't eat the same as the one in California. They have similarities in, like, maybe the portions, the food groups, and like the amount or the source of the protein, the fact that all of them eat a lot of antioxidants and plants. But it's different types. They're different. Maybe in Japan they eat more rice. In California they eat more corn. Like, it varies, and also local communities also, like, the fact that they do it without knowledge, let's say, but it's knowledge in another way, because culturally it's fast to them and everything, and they are so healthy still, and they don't need an NGO to come and, like, make a crop for them, because they already know how to do it for some reason. Like, they just grew up like that. And that's also fun, like, to realize and to try and, as Emily said, try to learn more from them, because we are so, like, set to the guidelines or whatever, like, these scientists said. But also, what does your community do? Like, what do you want to eat that makes you feel good, and that your body's telling you, like, okay, like, this is giving me energy, this is giving me emotional stability, and, like, a lot of things that we need to thrive in life. So yeah, that's
The funny thing is, I think that, oh, sorry.
we all want to talk.
But I think that, good, I love this. This is the energy I'm looking for. I think with a cup of your red wine, we could be up here for all day. But anyway, in moderation. No, I think the funny thing is that the modern scientific movement tends to look often at these kind of traditional indigenous practices as not scientific. But in fact, I mean, what is a scientific process but trial, error, and proof? And what is better trial, error, and proof than having done something for thousands of years in a culture that is healthy and thriving because of it? I mean, that is the definition of scientific proof. So the funny thing is, we have to, on both sides of the equation, especially on the modern scientific side, change the way we think about those kind of practices. Go ahead.
Sí, no, o sea, on that aspect, for sure, it's never going to work if we stick to our side of the elephant. Do you know this thing? O sea, it's not never the whole picture, no? And the more open we are to different paths of life, o sea, the richer our experience in our life can be. O sea, it's very soberbio, I forget the word in English, to assume that we own anything about the truth.
It's superior.
So
Bringing it full circle.
We're gonna, like, comment.
I wanted to sort of dig into this question that these important things that you're all raising about, like, expertise and local expertise and body knowledge and expertise, and kind of I think this really builds on Emily's work, but it's kind of a question for everybody. One of the things that I found in studying the history of dietary reform movements, right, where people are trying to change other people's diets, often in an imposing upper middle class ideals about what a good diet is on others. Those ideals reflect, certain tastes, preferences, histories, and values, and then are imposed on others. But one of the things that I've learned about these dietary reform movements in general is that they're often trying to solve problems that aren't actually food problems. So sometimes I'm going to propose, if you are to really attend to a community's needs and learn and grow and work with, what we might find, even as food obsessed as we are, is that the answer isn't in food. It's not a garden, and it's not putting produce in a liquor store, and it's not a CSA either, right? And that can be challenging to those of us who are, food minded. But you spoke to this, right, about land sovereignty, about migrant workers, about reproductive sovereignty, right? And if you, in some communities, if you went and asked, like, what can we do to improve your foodways, right? It might be about water, or it might be about transportation, or it might be about jobs and livelihood. And so I just wanted to open up that kind of question.
It's moments like this that I feel like we're all students in Charlotte's class. She brings us back to focus. Sorry, go ahead. Anybody want to chime in? What? It's so quiet.
But we're thinking, how do you build good collectives so that you can move political change? And I think that food actually comes to making good collectives. So at the heart of a lot of collective action is people that are like feeding that work. So I think you can kind of do both and of, make it not about food, but food still is a piece of that work. So that would be one of my thoughts back to that.
Yeah.
I'm loving this. So I want to come back to you for a second, Maria, a little off topic, because we talked a minute earlier with you about antioxidants, and you mentioned it, but you didn't mention polyphenols. And okay, did you? Okay, well, because I wanted you to talk about that, because this is, in wine, and we haven't, this is one of its big benefits. And I think you said that we haven't really shown the health benefits of wine, but I think there are earlier studies and that have come out, talking about the positive benefits of polyphenol, obviously in moderation, but still.
About polyphenols, yes, because it's shown that tannins and anthocyanins and all those are good for health, and it's sustained by clinical papers. But when we talk about wine, people has the idea of alcohol in general, and doesn't look at that, which is something that come up with the fermentation. So, and the other day I was also reading about it, that polyphenols in the gut with the microbiota, they have more, they split in a way that they have more influence in good health. So I think that that's one of the points. And that's why all the scientific says that we have to gather more data, we have to study more how wine is good for health, because right now there are many information going away from all. There is a clinical paper from Harvard that say that alcohol is bad for the health, that none of alcohol. And so what do you think about this? But if you take the wine itself, the grape with the polyphenols and all that, it's good for the health. So that's for you,
Health according to what? Like, what is health in that?
Good health in general, That you don't get, for example, it's shown that it's good for the cardiovascular diseases. There are less cardiovascular diseases. It's good for inflammatory processes. It's I haven't studied too much the polyphenols, but the antioxidants has that input, in health. So,
Yeah. Don't you think it's interesting that, like the French, for example, you're always just from age-old time, let's have some wonderfully thick, rich, yummy cheese
At the end.
which is fatty, right?
Yes.
Which is fatty and maybe not so great for your cardiovascular health. It is looked at through some lenses. And then what do they have it with? Wine, which can thin things, move things along, and then have the polyphenol that can kind of help to balance that out. Because of course everybody's on their own soapbox, right? So there have been some, the two guys who were focused on heart, I'm drawing a blank on his name right now. And he pulled the meat and cheese out of their diets and the cardiac patients got better, right? But it's okay, well, what if you are having a little bit of meat and cheese in your diet, which is taking the cardiovascular health one way, and then you're having polyphenols and wine, and then it's not heated too, so it has the enzymatic benefit there, plus all of the microbes that make the wine. So it's okay, we're bringing this one little challenge in a tiny little bit of the meal. There's this one little challenge. And that community has always paired wine with cheese. And I can't help but think, that culture naturally put a little bit of yin with the young, and now everything's kind of okay. It works out okay,
Yeah,
you know.
and it has been working for more than 10,000 years.
Right.
So
Right.
it
I
cannot
recently
be
went to
bad, though.
Pompeii and I got to see some
I have
really
to go to France.
yeah. But I was looking at these mosaics in Pompeii that recently uncovered, and they all sort of include wine and food and so on and so forth. Look, it's definitely been part of humanity since anyone figured out how to make wine. And I do think it's important to separate wine from other distillates because
Yes.
they're very different.
Yes.
And I think sometimes they put them together in analyses. And again, that's wine in moderation. And you were talking earlier about differences after 40 and so on. And I always joke that, look, if you can drink at 40 like you did at 20, you might have a problem. So like this is just sort of, we can all take that home with us. That's your dietary tip for today. I actually have a friend who's this famous cardiologist. I won't name him because I'm going to offer up his confession. One, he said that, red wine certainly has a benefit for the heart, but he also confessed that, for someone with serious heart issues, that the vegan diet is the best possible diet. And then he followed it with, but some things are just not worth living without. And I think, look, I think it's an important point. Again, somebody who has a very serious heart issue and who is being told by their doctor, you may want to try this because it will be the best for you at this moment in time. That's not something that everyone has to do or maybe good for everyone or necessary for everyone. So it is that there's both the in personal choice and what is right for you at this point in time in your life trajectory, which will change. And then there is the other side of the equation, which is what are the opportunities, systemic issues, problems that many are facing in terms of trying to do best. And then there's the other arc, which is let's continue to respect and honor and understand and perhaps put research into traditional practices instead of fighting against traditional practices, since they seem to have worked for a long time. So there just might be something in there for us all to learn from. Did you want to say something? You look like you're about to wrap us up in a positive way and bring us back to school. All right, we're going to listen.
I know, actually, it's totally different. I have a question, a very naive question, which is sometimes the pursuit of longevity can seem very isolating. And people can become obsessed with a particular lifestyle or diet or self-improvement campaign that's very much about their own longevity and can be isolating and sort of self-referential and self-focused. Yeah, and I was just wondering, those of you who've thought a lot more than I have about the practice of eating for longevity, how you think about that and how you balance some of those tendencies that we have in our culture to drive in a very individualistic way for our own longevity.
Yeah, you know what? For example, in Wine in Moderation, we were talking about the other day about different cultures, but also in those different cultures, there are people with different genetic situations. So you cannot put everybody in the same way, no? You have to think what is better for everyone, no? And that's one of the points. The genetics of everyone is different. So what suits to you, perhaps for the other not, no? So,
I mean, I'll answer from my perspective as someone who did go, super elitist on my dietary thinking. One of the biggest things that has come aside from recovering my health to expanding my diet, opening my mind to other things is this sense of coming home. Like I feel like I belong again. Whereas when I was eating in this really specific, narrow way, I felt isolated. I felt lonely. I felt like it was difficult for me to connect with everyone around me because I didn't have that shared experience. It wasn't, when the plates were passed around, I didn't feel like it was my place to share with all the people around me. And that is extremely isolating. Mm-hmm. And if we look at the research of it's just as dangerous to feel lonely as it is to smoke a pack of cigarettes a day, I can't help but think that just, centering your food concepts around how can I be a part of the whole, I can't help but think there's some gold in there.
And you cited Michael Pollan earlier with the eat food, not mostly plants, not too much. But if we don't add and with other people, if we don't start thinking outside of ourselves to think about the communities that we're with, what's to your point, what is the point of thinking about longevity?
Okay, now we're about to wrap this up. So if anyone has any final thoughts, now's the chance.
Yeah,
Yes,
me
please.
too. About isolation that you were saying, that there's like things that are not worth living without. For example,
He will not be named.
That's exactly what she means by the isolating of going like in a narrow dietary path or like lifestyle in general. If you don't open up your scope, like specifically here in Ensenada, that we have a lot of wine, right? Like if someone doesn't drink wine, maybe they can be a little isolated in a way, like in a social like gathering or something. Well, you won't fit in as much if you don't like wine, you know? And that happens too. Like while someone was talking, I remembered of my grandma that she had a lot of health problems, diabetes and like renal malfunction and everything. And she got to a point like she always cared about living and enjoying and not about restrictions. And it has to be like not the other side of like, oh, I don't care, I will eat whatever makes me happy, or I will go out with my friends and if they're eating chips and chocolate, I will eat even though it's bad for me and I know I have a disease. And like, but she was living and she maybe didn't have like that many years as someone that gets to more than 100 at a blue zone, but for the years that she lived, she was enjoying and she didn't feel isolated because she didn't restrict herself. So it's getting to a point in between in which you do like sometimes restrict yourself in some things. If you're maybe looking to get pregnant, you're in the fertility path, you have hormonal imbalances, well, you maybe have to restrict a little bit more because you're creating life, and the life that you're creating, you have to genetically try to pass them the best that you have, right? But maybe if you're like 40 something, 50 something, 60 something, and you're just like, okay, I'm going to eat good because I want to keep like living more years, but it's okay if sometimes I don't restrict in this and in that. So it depends on the life stage that you're living, of course, and in finding the way that you don't feel isolated, but you don't feel restricted. So you feel fine, you feel okay, you feel complete and wholesome in a healthy way, right? So I think that's the key to longevity and nutrition and health in general.
I don't know, your question made me think of, I mean, should longevity be the goal?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh my God.
Because, I mean, it's kind of a paradoxical situation because you are doing all these things and kind of entering sort of a race. No, this experience that you told was kind of being in a race, but you want to get somewhere fast, but isn't the goal just to enjoy the time that you are here? So it's I understand. That's a good question.
I would rather leave a good world for the next generation and live forever myself.
Yeah, definitely.
So I feel like I keep going back to what you said. You had a lot of gems, Emily. And one of them in particular, that companion, is with bread. And it seems sort of like if there's a synopsis, it is that eating well, mindfully, consciously, food prepared by people who have autonomy, freedom, that animals, humans, the entirety of the system created for you, if not by you, for you with love, that this notion of community is paramount. And probably at the end of the day, yes, there are certainly eat this, not that, paradigms, and we probably already know what they are, even if we choose to ignore them sometimes. But thinking about it in the larger context is really where the magic lies. And I hope that you took that away from today. So thank you, and thanks UCTV.
So I don't necessarily have a question, but hi there. I did want to just share some perspective from somebody who's not from the food world. But I did really relate to a lot of the things you said, because I am from Bangladesh originally, and I grew up in the States, and so we practiced the whole communal living, except I didn't know what that was because I was trying to assimilate and be American. And so my perspective was always, the things that my grandma or my mom or my aunt did. It was kind of embarrassing for me, to be quite frank, as an American. I just particularly remember going to like a school, field trip. Everybody else had Lunchables, and I had a tiffin full of curry. And so I'm like, I'm this smelly like Indian girl that has ginger and turmeric. And it's so funny because these things now, I look back on it, I'm like, wow, like they were cooking whole foods, right? And like, I was so embarrassed of it, but now it's like, okay, now I'm trying to incorporate that with my children, with my kids. That was just one thing that I wanted to share. The other thing was, has anybody heard of Sapa in Vietnam? It's like a northwest mountain region. And my husband and I were big travelers. We like to go on different adventures. And so pre-kids, we did this trekking hike in a town called Sapa. And it's beautiful rice fields. And we did this trekking adventure where you'd go up a mountain. You have a guide with you, a local guide. And you stay the night, in these villagers' homes, and you eat with them, you talk with them, you drink with them, everything. You're just experiencing life in that area. And so the interesting thing was, as we were going up these hikes, there's local, I don't want to say the word, local villagers. I don't want to say peddlers, but they would literally follow you along with your guide. And, they'd carry their babies, walking up with you. Meanwhile, we're like struggling Americans, following our guide up this hill. And there'd be like grandmas in their 70s and 80s. And I turned to my guide and I was like, how are they doing this right now? Like, do they not have like arthritis? Like what? And then he turns to me and he's like, what is arthritis? And I explained it to him. And I'm like, it's inflammation of XYZ, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, no, we don't have that. And I'm like, well, what do people, pass away from? And they're like, they just, pass away when they're older. And so, meanwhile, my husband and I, healthy bodied in our young 20s back then, were like struggling, and this grandma was like out, passing us in this mountain. It was just very, very like it clicked. Something clicked in my mind. I'm like, everything that you guys just said made so much sense. I'm like, they don't. One other interesting thing about that story was when I asked him about the food, he was like, well, the villagers, we're poor here. We just eat mainly plants. Only the rich people can afford pork and meat. And I just thought to myself, like, well, what is rich? Define richness, right? Because now these people who are healthy and able-bodied, they're eating from what they're growing. And so I just wanted to make that comment and share that it's so relatable. Yeah, thank you.
And while you're passing the mic around for the next questions, it's interesting that there were these diseases that only came from being more wealthy and eating more meat and eating more. It was like gout is a great example. Like it was the disease of the nobleman, right? So it's like not like affluence and being able to buy so much more meat, so much more cheese, so many of those things, maybe not all around good, right? So maybe that comes back into it too, is like the distribution of wealth, the distribution of nutrients, the distribution of everything might be better in the bigger picture than, the nobles can have all of the meat and stuff that they want, but they end up with these diseases that cause extreme pain. Gout causes, like, if you don't know what it is, it causes like crystalline, like in the blood, in the body. And so it feels like you're being stabbed from the inside out. And it comes from eating this really acidic, really rich, really meat and cheese filled diets.
Mm-hmm. We've been talking like people who eat. And I would really appreciate, if you can, like one phrase of each one of you about hunger, if I may.
She wants to sort of talk to you about eating and food. Yes. And then we talked a little bit about the lack of access to, but let's talk about, who wants to talk about hunger?
I can talk really quickly. So I did this project last summer with a group of, is this on? Can you hear? Yeah, okay. With a group of Guatemalan anthropologists. And we went into a community, and this is a community that has been marked as, chronically malnourished, highest rates of hunger, in the world. And we wanted to understand what that word meant and how they would translate it. And it was quite interesting because, of course, hunger is an English word, and then hambre is a Spanish word, and this was a mom-speaking community. And so we went, and it was really hard to translate because people said, we are not, the way that you're talking about our food not being okay, our food's okay. actually we need, and then they started talking about border crossing and other, poverty, dispossession, violence, these kinds of questions. And they were really insistent. And this is an area that, World Bank says 6th most chronically malnourished community in the world. And they actually were very insistent. No, our food is okay. Our corn is good. We know how to grow. Our problem is, and then, violence, borders, land dispossession. They had stories of plantation labor. But it was quite interesting that they wouldn't stay with hunger and food together, but hunger and these kind of broader issues of what Paul Farmer might call structural violence.
Yeah, I was going to say something that's really complementary to that in response to your question, which is just that when you posed the question, what came to mind for me is like that it really matters how we frame and name the problem of hunger. And that's largely what you're speaking to as well. But, if we frame and name the problem very narrowly, then it's, for example, about, providing food so that people are no longer hungry. If we frame it slightly more around food insecurity, then there might be more of an interest in providing a stable source of culturally appropriate and desirable foods. If we frame it even more broadly, then it becomes very politicized and it becomes inseparable from questions about, the social structures that cause poverty, including, racism and international relations, right? So we can frame way out here and we can frame very narrowly, and those have consequences in terms of how we understand what the solutions are and what is to be done about it.
Yeah, one of the things in Mexico now is the lack of rain, the lack of water, and that is going to spread the poverty in many places in Mexico, and perhaps in the future is going to be more people in hunger than as we are used to, no? So, and those are things that haven't been addressed in a good way. And with global warming, it's something that is going to increase, no? There's going to be less water in the future. So that's a point that we have to address, I think, as soon as possible. If not, we are not going to have what to eat.
Because I was thinking on the same lines as Maria. No? And, I mean, I think it's a word that, unfortunately, we are all gonna get to know a lot better because, I mean, this climate emergency that we're in will put the resilience of all our agricultural systems to the test. It's not just the most vulnerable ones now, no. It's gonna be a general thing for all of us, no? So, see, I mean, big ag is not impervious to this. So, even if it has resources and you have no energy and power and no stuff to bring in water to, no, but it is very, very vulnerable in a lot of ways, no? And its resiliency, no, its capacity to adapt to sudden change is questionable.
So I think climate change is sort of at the heart of much of the problem today, and that's the source of climate change, changing climate deforestation, forcing migration, which then, of course, domestic policy around the globe is trying to be key. And then you sort of have this dynamic of haves and have-nots, which often is north and south, but not always. And then you have the haves who have too much food and waste food, about 40 to 50%, depending on which food you're talking about. Yep. And then you have in the have-not arena, you have, ironically, the same amount of not waste, but loss, because there it's issues of lack of infrastructure, food dying on the vine, no transportation, no refrigeration, can't get it to the community. So we have this problem. It has to do, interestingly, it's not that there isn't enough currently to go around. It's the disparate way in which it is available to various communities around the globe, and the will, quite frankly, of the have group to make sure that it gets into communities where it needs to be as an emergent sort of matter, but more importantly, that systemic change that it deals with, you can no longer grow in your community, and perhaps you need to be able to have access to another community. And so these are huge political, financial questions, and it's not simply a matter of hunger, I think.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would say it was single story to share about hunger from me. This is just my personal experience, but I'll share it with you for what it's worth. one of the many things that I tried to get rid of SIBO was a water fast. Has anybody ever done this? Water fast? Don't. So on about day 7, I dropped below the weight threshold, and the doctor who was guiding me through it decided, no, you're below the weight threshold. You need to do this. And I just remember this insane guilt that came over me because I realized like this horrible way that your body feels, that your mind starts to get loopy, that you feel almost out of body level of pain. Like there are people experiencing that. And here I am in my San Diego home doing this to myself on purpose, right? Like what an idiot. Like talk about a humbling experience that made me realize how completely unforgivable it is that UCTV, that there are people experiencing this everywhere daily and I'm paying someone to be guided not to eat. Like you can't imagine the sense of just guilt and regret and just kind of pull my head out of my own butt and start to think like, okay, what do we all need to be doing? Because it is actually experiencing hunger yourself. You know, obviously I was doing it on purpose, you guys. So I don't in any way compare this to people who are starving because they don't have the means. But when you realize there are people starving without the means and you're starving with the means, like it really is a wake up call to be like, this is absolutely unforgivable. And we all need to bear the responsibility for distributing the wealth, distributing the food in an efficient way that helps people who don't have the means to help themselves.
Mm-hmm. And when you told the question about hunger, I actually thought about like hungry about what, but not hungry exactly about food. Because here in Mexico, I've also had the chance, like during my studies in university and everything, interact with less economically privileged communities. And what I saw is that not exactly they don't have food, and they're not like they are not experiencing hunger as we may think, like they're really thin or they're below the weight threshold and everything. But instead, there's a lot of people in these communities or in general that maybe don't have the economic means or that maybe they even have obesity. So they are hunger of knowledge or of access to water. In these communities, they all have Coke, they all have chips, they all have processed foods. And for some reason, that gets to the most remote communities in all of Mexico. And in the top of a mountain, they do have like a little abarrotes with Coca-Cola and all of that, but they don't have access to maybe artichoke, and they don't even know what that is, or to asparagus, or to different types of produce that it's nourishing for them. And what they have, it's a different type of hunger, because malnutrition is not necessarily having like a low weight and all of that. It's also, you can be obese and be malnourished. So that's like the hunger that I was like thinking about when you asked the question. And it's also, I feel a really big problem. Like we have to focus on nutritional education overall. And the problem of hunger because of the lack of food, I don't think it's as big as we think. Well, at least in my experience, like here in Mexico, that we are like a country with those type of problems, but more like, the access to different types of foods, but also knowing how to eat and where, because it's even cheaper for them to make beans and maybe zucchini, that it's not like, it's a crop that they can have there. And that will be better than eating the processed foods that they have access to. But in their minds, you go to the supermarket and it's cheaper to buy a bag of chips than buying like different fresh fruits and vegetables. So they think like, well, it's misinformation. And that's also like a type of hunger in a way.
Someone described for me a story in a small area, top of a mountain in Mexico. And they were saying that the medical providers wouldn't come up there, so there was an issue with healthcare. There was no fresh produce in that community, and no one was delivering it. But by God, the Bevo truck somehow managed.
It's impressive.
And I think it's sort of it's an issue of access. And I'm glad that you mentioned malnourishedness, because there is real hunger, and there are communities of absolute hunger who do not have enough food. but there are as many communities with malnourishment who calorically might be fine, but they're not getting the nutrition
Yes.
or health. And that's also problematic, very problematic.
I'm going to go in Spanish, it's going to be quicker. Tenemos un movimiento para estar rescatando lo que llamamos la cocina tradicional. A finales de abril tuvimos un evento con 100 comensales donde invitamos a 3 cocineros y cocineras tradicionales de Michoacán, a otros 2 de Baja California y a varios chefs. Aquello fue muy interesante porque pues la mañana, los que han estado en este medio, es un caos la cocina y pues bueno, tuvimos que expandir el área de preparación para el evento y la parte interesante que observé fue cómo las cocineras tradicionales de Baja California, una que venía del área muy lejana de Tecate y otra de Ensenada, cada una de ellas hizo entre 3 y 4 horas para llegar al espacio a cocinar. No nos aceptaron el hospedaje y esto hizo que pues llegaran cansadas, por supuesto. Fue un día de trabajo arduo y pues los chefs que andaban entre sus 30, 40 años, muchísimo más joven que todas ellas, ya estaban cansados a mediodía. Ellas traían una batería impresionante y a eso de las 8 o 9 de la noche, una de ellas se acerca y me dice, la más grande, oye Roberto, necesito que me des un raite al finalizar el evento. Oye, sí, encantado, pero es a las 11 de la noche. Sí, no importa, es que mañana tengo una cita. Ok, sí. La llevé al aeropuerto. Le estaba dejando entre 12 y media de la noche. Su avión salía a las 2 de la mañana y su cita al día siguiente era a las 6. O sea, la fuerza de la mujer, a lo que quiero caer, era impresionante. Y cuando los muchachos les preguntaron, oye, ¿es que no te cansas? Sí, me dice, pero pues es que ustedes comen puro cochinero. O sea, lo que voy es que sí hace eco lo que comentan de volver a las raíces, volver a la alimentación y cómo estas mujeres en sus 60 promedios tenían más actividad y más fuerza que estos muchachos en sus 40 y aprendiendo a cocinar cosas que no sabían que ni existían. Gracias por compartir.
I loved your question, Natalia, because it's not really related to hunger, what I wanted to just share with you, but I'm aquaculture producer of oysters, and not only in oysters, but there are bluefin tuna, and there's a lot of I'm talking about the oceans. It's not my agriculture expertise, but I think we also have to find the balance in these foods that become very expensive, and then anciently in some fishing towns in Mexico, people, you look at them and their skin is beautiful and they were healthy and they didn't have high cholesterol or anything. But now we are buying a dozen oysters for $40 that you then find in the restaurants in the States. That's $4 each oyster. So it's nice. We businessmen would love to have, and businesswomen would love to have more profits. But I think it's very, we have to be very responsible as to also the information, because these people now don't have oysters. In Guerrero Negro, you go around all the town, people that go to see the whales and whatever, and it's incredible that you don't find oysters in any restaurant because there's a high demand and everything it's been exported, or like with the bluefin tuna that now we don't find sardine at a good price because all the bluefin tuna eat the sardine. So it's not that I want to put a bullet on my feet as aquaculture businesswoman, but I do invite everybody to also question ourselves. What are we doing? Like, there should be a balance. People should be able to keep on going to the shore and eat oysters that are wildly born, because we do it in aquaculture. But the public policies, I think they have to be more aware of that. And if they are not, we should find a way to help. And I'm not doing it in a program formally, but I just wanted to share with all of you because one of my employees told me the other day that he's not eating more oysters and he has them free because the doctor told him that it has high cholesterol. But he is drinking Coke, like Ale said, and he's having a lot of pork that we don't know how good it is, the one that he's buying. So this ignorance makes me like very mad because the doctor just said, oh, high cholesterol. But he doesn't know that it's a whole food, that it has niacin, vitamin A, vitamin D, everything, you know? So just my question that I don't expect an answer is like you that are so experts in this and you write books and things. And I know that you've been in communities. I think it's so nourishing. I love that I came. And I appreciate everything that you have shared to us.
So I think about what you said about oysters. So I don't eat animals. So like a lot of people who are vegetarian or vegan, I like quinoa. And I had to be very mindful because suddenly the entire universe became obsessed with quinoa, right? Oh my God, it's the protein, high, rich grain, right? Except that now, just like the oysters, the communities that grow the quinoa no longer can afford it and have access to it. So it makes me step back. So I think anytime some one item becomes the new panacea, cure-all, or just becomes super popular, whether it's oysters or uni or bluefin tuna, it doesn't matter, then suddenly there's this obsession, or salmon, right? And everybody wants it every day, all the time, and then it sort of destroys communities. And we have to be mindful of that. And that's sort of my take on that issue. Mm-hmm. All of us as consumers, you know, we can affect a community positively, but we can also affect it negatively. And we have to be mindful of that impact in either of it. And anyone else?
I'll just share something that you said. You don't want to shoot yourself in the foot, right? Mm-hmm. Or you said you don't want to put a bullet in your foot. And I always think like, okay, so for example, you're harvesting oysters, okay? Other people are fishing, they're overfishing the oceans or whatever. I feel like as a society, we value the price of the oyster and we pay you for the oyster, okay? But does your company pay a fee to the entire world ecosystem that it's pulling all the oysters out, right? Or it's overfishing the ocean? I feel like we pull resources from the planet, whether we're taking, trees and we're going to make paper, or we're taking, food from the ocean and then we're selling it to people. Where are we recouping the cost for what we're pulling from the natural resources? And I'm not asking you to answer that question either, but I feel like that for me is a missing piece when I look at the whole picture. Is like, okay, if we're overfishing and there is no more bluefin tuna, for example, then the people who, yes, they have to pay for the boats, they have to pay for the fishermen, they have to pay for it to be refrigerated. I get it. Like they do have certain expenses, but there is a cost to all of us that those resources are being plucked from the ocean, plucked from the world, and we're not asking the people who pull those resources to give back any of those profits to like in the forestry industry, they were forced to replant, right? Like, okay, you're going to take trees. Yeah, you might own the land, but you can't account for the fact that you're taking the trees to make paper, which means there's less oxygen on the planet for all of us. So then they're forced to replant the trees. I think part of what you're asking is that we do need to have a bigger conversation of like, are you responsible for making sure there's more oysters growing? Are we responsible for making sure that there is an area where bluefin can respawn? I mean, I'm just using these as examples, but that's what comes up for me when you ask that question is, how can we profit from something that we pull from the earth in any way, shape, or form? And then also be asked to do the math and put back into the earth any of the resources that we're taking in order to operate as a whole.
Well, historically, in the modern economies in the West, certainly in the United States, we've simply externalized the cost of whatever environmental impact our business model has, and then society as a whole is required to pay it instead of those who might have affected it. So we have time for one more question. Yes. You, right here, Gaela, up in the front from World Design Capital.
Yes. Thank you. So as Michelle mentioned, San Diego, Tijuana has been designated the World Design Capital for this year. And I think that when we think of food, that's not the first thing that comes up when you think of design. Like food isn't the first thing you think of. Yeah. However, we're really, really proud to have this conversation be a part of our designation year, because a lot of the things that you guys are talking about is implementing design thinking within these different systems, right? And how can we design for optimal health through the individual, community, and systems perspective, right? So my question is more directed to Charlotte, but I would love to open it up to anybody just to better understand the research that you're doing with design thinking for food, but also how you're applying that. What's the application of that research that you're doing? So thank you very much.
So that was a grant-funded experiment between myself and somebody who was expert in design thinking and who had worked for a long time in food and beverage design for IDEO, which is the design firm that really came up with the process for design thinking. And she also had a PhD in food science from my department. But what the experiment was really about was what happens if we take that lens and try to combine it with the food studies perspective. And that's what I brought. Sort of recognizing some of the limits of design thinking in terms of considering context broadly. So not just talking, design thinking is well known for like going into people's homes and really getting deep into understanding people's wants and needs. From a centering, the people who are being designed for, but doesn't have a lot of capacity around understanding social dynamics, understanding political context, social context, inequalities, et cetera, all of that. So we tried bringing those two skill sets together to see what would happen if we brought them into the classroom. And the other key component of that is that we were both really committed to what we called radical multidisciplinarity. Which is something that we both had learned from our professional experience is just really important, but not something that people tend to experience as students, or a lot of times in the world. So we fought against the university in every capacity to try to bring graduate students from across the silos into one class to give them the tools of design thinking and food studies and really focusing on creating these multidisciplinary groups. So you would have a computer scientist potentially, and a historian and a food scientist working on a project together, right? And on, various examples of that. And then we worked with campus partners and stakeholders to define a problem and really give our students as much access as they could to working with stakeholders. So the last 2 years that the class was offered, or 3, we worked on food insecurity among students, student food insecurity in particular on our campus. So we worked with the Basic Needs Center, and we worked with the student farm, and we got our students engaged in working on those questions. But I think ultimately, it was an experiment in bringing the two methodologies together, and I still believe that there's some promise in doing that.
And I love what you were saying about sort of the multidisciplinary aspect, because obviously, everything we've talked about today is in fact multidisciplinary, and we're talking about systemic change, a model for producing food, for creating, for serving, for enjoying food that is good for me, good for my community, and good for the environment. So it is multidisciplinary. And you made me think of this earlier, and I didn't say it, but one year I was asked to be on a panel of food and technology, and I thought to myself, this is the opposite of who I am. Why are you asking me to be here? And so, because I've often looked at tech as the enemy, right? And so it really took time for me to research. Let's look at areas in which technology has been and can be really great in solving the problems we're talking about, whether it's in utilizing cameras already in place to, be more efficient in water use, using data analysis, like all of these ways in which, to better the system with these incredible skill sets, whether it's medical, nutritional, tech, and so on. So the idea that we can create systems, not just traditional systems, but utilize the new expertise that is available and create a better designed system that can actually respond to the problems instead of creating new ones.
Yeah.
No.
Alex, quickly, and then we'll go to you. One of the things that I think is really key to multidisciplinary collaboration and also to good design is humility. Because collaborating across disciplines, you have to know your own limits. There's no reason to collaborate if you think you have all the answers. And we tend to be trained, we're so disciplinary in our training that it can become hard to see outside of our own training and to understand the limits of it, right? So in order to work across those differences, you have to be humble about where your expertise ends so that you can really engage with and appreciate the expertise of others. And that is a good quality for design.
And check, not just your own limitations of your own expertise, but check whatever biases, that was my experience, but biases I may have had against some other, discipline, and instead open up to the idea that they had something to offer that I had yet to understand.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
So Rupa Benjamin is a theorist who has this idea that a lot of the entrenched inequalities that we're looking at are there by design. And systems are pretty good at reproducing themselves. So you get inequalities there and they will be set up to kind of reproduce. And when I was working with interviewing a lot of the people in the UN about what their imaginaries for their designs were, there was a lot of top-down intervention, a lot of discussion of we need to target this community, target that community. And that language of target is super warfare, and so part of the really interesting work actually was I worked with a team of PhDs who were looking at how these designs were implemented in different places. In some ways, this, to borrow Sally Mary's term, the vernacularization of the kind of global interventions. And one of the thoughts was that we need systems designs that are able to take all the local variation and feed them back up, so that we're changing cultures of policymakers, changing cultures of designers, not just changing local Guatemalan culture. And so really thinking about what it would be to kind of reimagine the design systems so that they're not target driven, but much more, as you were saying, iterative all the way through, with the realization that systems will, though, want to reproduce these inequalities if they're set up for that. So how can you really kind of feedback against that is a great open question for
There's a great
work.
organization in the San Diego area, UCSD, called the Global Art. And what the founder is attempting to do is he works in local communities and asking them, what are the issues? What do you need help? What things might, this giant research body and arm that is available, how can we help you? And so he has shifted that paradigm. So it starts at the community and they say, this is what we'd like research on, or this is what we need help with. And so instead, he brings that back to the community who can then do it from that direction instead of the targeting from the top down. And it's, look, it's not magic, but it is somewhat novel, unfortunately. And so the more widespread that kind of practice becomes, I think that's a real system change.
So this is going to be really quick, and it's not a question, but it's kind of an answer to your proposition about what are we going to do because we're taking so much out of the planet without anybody having to give back to the planet. I just want to call people's attention to Hazel Henderson, who wrote a book called Limits to Growth, and her philosophy, which is now being accepted by more and more companies. And I encourage everybody who's in a position to do anything to move that needle to do that, which is the idea of the 3-point capitalistic system, which is the way that you develop and nurture your bottom line is you have to include the 3 Ps, which are people, planet, and then profit. And if everybody did that, which is a form of capitalism that nobody's arguing with here, that we would have a much more equitable system throughout the world. Thank you very much. Very interesting time.
Yes.